The Xorvathi had long prided themselves on their precision in combat. Their sleek, well-calibrated ships were built for speed and stealth, ideal for patrolling the contested space around the Harkoon 7 star system. As the Xorvathi frigate Gloreth cut through the void, its sensors detected an anomaly, a lone, unmarked vessel drifting through the sector. At first glance, it seemed like a standard Terran cargo ship. No weapons, no shields. The kind of target that screamed easy pickings for a species like the Xorvathi, who prided themselves on outmaneuvering larger fleets with ease. Commander Volncaris studied the ship's trajectory on the holo display, a smirk curling across his sharp features. His species had dominated this sector for centuries. No one dared to trespass here. "Approach with caution," he ordered his crew. "It's either a pirate trying to avoid detection or a Terran ship hoping to escape the attention of larger fleets. Either way, we'll make an example of them." The Xorvathi frigate accelerated, moving into a silent intercept position just behind the Terran vessel. Its communications officer, Officer Accelera, initiated the hail. The channel crackled for a moment before it connected to a calm, almost bored voice. "This is the TSS Brimstone. State your intentions." Accelera froze. There was no static, no scrambling signals. The Terran voice was crystal clear, as though they were speaking from right outside their airlock. It was unnerving. It wasn't the usual panicked or defensive tone of a ship caught by the Xorvathi. "Terran cargo vessel. You are in a restricted zone." Karis's voice was cold. "Surrender your vessel and prepare to be boarded." There was a long pause on the line. Then the same voice responded, its calmness grating on Karis's nerves. "I'd suggest you don't." Before Karis could issue an order, the Brimstone sprang to life. In an instant, the Terran vessel flickered into hyperdrive. Only it didn't go far. It blinked, just a few kilometers ahead. The Gloreth was caught off guard by the sudden shift in position, scrambling to react. But before the Xorvathi crew could recover, the Brimstone opened fire. 2 explosive volleys that slammed into the Gloreth's forward shields with a force that shook the entire ship. Karis's eyes widened. That wasn't just firepower. It was an annihilation strike. The Gloreth's shields flickered, buckling under the shockwave. "Return fire," Karis shouted, his voice filled with panic for the first time in years. But as soon as the command left his lips, the Brimstone was gone again, blinking several kilometers away. There was no time to track its movements. It was as if the ship was toying with them, darting between intervals and time itself. The Gloreth fired wildly, missing each time as the Brimstone zigged and zagged, disappearing and reappearing like a nightmare. Then came another deadly volley, aimed directly at the frigate's engines. Shields failing. Accelera reported. Karis slammed his fist on the console. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. This was a slaughter. "We need to retreat," another officer called out. But it was too late. The Gloreth's engine room exploded in a burst of plasma, and the ship was doomed. All around them, the crew could hear the sounds of alarms blaring and people scrambling. But the Brimstone didn't stop. With terrifying efficiency, it dismantled the Xorvathi vessel, turning their warship into a floating hulk. Karis was one of the last to escape, managing to board an escape pod as the Gloreth shattered into space debris. His eyes, wide with disbelief and fury, remained fixed on the space where the Brimstone had just vanished. As the pod drifted away, he managed to send one final transmission back to his fleet. "It's not just their weapons. It's the way they fight. We made a mistake." And then, all was silent. The transmission from the escape pod, carrying Commander Karis's final words, reached the central command of the Xorvathi fleet several hours later. The moment the message hit the comms grid, it spread like wildfire through the higher echelons of military leadership. The intelligence officers scrambled to analyze the data, but the damage had already been done. A single Terran vessel had taken down a full Xorvathi patrol and left no trace of its intentions. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could a lone ship, armed with what appeared to be basic Terran weaponry, annihilate one of their most advanced warships? The Xorvathi had always prided themselves on their superiority in both technology and tactics, yet here was proof that their greatest asset, confidence, had betrayed them. The Council of Species, always eager to downplay any threat to their collective power, dismissed the event as an anomaly, a freak accident, they called it, a miscalculation on both sides. But there was a murmur, a whisper of something far more sinister. And soon, that murmur began to grow. Xorvathi military strategists pored over every available piece of intel, every scrap of data they could gather. A quiet panic set in. In hushed tones, they began to speak of the Brimstone and other Terran vessels, ships that seemed to pop up from nowhere, strike with lightning speed, and vanish without leaving a trace. The reports weren't just from the Xorvathi. The Saldri, a reptilian species known for their ruthlessness in combat, reported similar incidents. The Thanner, an insectoid species with a reputation for swarming any enemy they could find, lost an entire squadron to a single Terran carrier. One by one, the galaxy's military powers began to recognize the pattern. Terran ships didn't follow the usual rules of war. They didn't engage in sustained conflicts. They didn't waste time negotiating or making deals. The Terrans came. They struck once, hard, and then they were gone. They fought like creatures that knew war intimately, with an aggression so cold and surgical it was almost predatory. At the heart of it all was a growing understanding. Terrans didn't just have powerful ships. They had warriors, the kind of warriors who were not constrained by conventional combat doctrine, who were willing to employ strategies that other species would never dare. A single Terran ship wasn't a fluke. It was a harbinger. Word quickly spread through the galaxy, passed along to military commanders and intelligence officers, then leaked into the civilian sectors. A name began to echo across the cosmos. Terran combat dominance. The phrase was murmured in the darkest corners of spaceports, spoken in grim tones as a warning. In a remote outpost on the edge of known space, an old alien tactician sat alone in a small, dimly lit room, scanning old Terran battle footage that had somehow made its way into his hands. His eyes flicked across the screen, watching the rapid, brutal engagements, seemingly random, but each one leaving nothing behind but destruction. As the footage ended, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face in disbelief. The Terrans weren't trying to conquer. They weren't even fighting for resources. They were fighting for something far more dangerous, to make their enemies so afraid that they would never challenge them again. They are war, the tactician muttered to himself, a chill running down his spine. And they will not stop until the entire galaxy knows their name. Across the galaxy, the phrase, "If you see a Terran ship, don't engage. Leave the sector. The Terrans don't want peace. They want to end it," began to appear on classified military bulletins. And with each new whisper, the dread of the Terrans grew. The footage had been smuggled in under the highest levels of security, a piece of clandestine data that could turn the balance of power in the galaxy. It was meant for the most trusted, highest-ranking officers who had come to terms with the growing threat of the Terran fleets. But nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. The TSS Valkyrie, a Terran dreadnought, appeared on screen, its massive frame hanging like a storm cloud above the wreckage of a shattered pirate fleet. The pirates had been seasoned veterans of galactic warfare, known for their ruthless efficiency and well-armed ships. But against the Valkyrie, they were little more than children with broken toys. The footage began with the Valkyrie engaging a small fleet of 3 pirate vessels in the uncharted Brixis 5 system. The pirates opened fire first, launching an aggressive salvo of torpedoes and blaster shots. The Valkyrie didn't flinch. The first wave hit its shields, but they flared like a distant storm, absorbing the energy with almost no visible damage. Then, in the blink of an eye, the Valkyrie fired back, 4 rapid bursts of energy that tore through one of the pirate ships, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of ionized particles. The second ship was gutted in seconds, the shields rendered useless by the overwhelming firepower. The third ship attempted to flee, but the Valkyrie wasn't finished. A strange phenomenon occurred. A distortion in the space around the ship, followed by the pirate vessel shaking violently, as if caught in an invisible grip. Then the Valkyrie fired once more, this time with a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. A concentrated pulse of energy lanced through space, warping reality itself as it struck the pirate ship's engines. The ship's hull shattered, as if its very molecules were torn apart. The pirates never had a chance. The entire engagement lasted no more than 5 minutes. Yet it wasn't the destruction that caused a chill in the hearts of the Galactic commanders who watched the footage. It was the behavior of the Terran vessel. There was no hesitation, no warning. The Terran captain didn't issue grand speeches or boastful threats. There was only one word on the comms, spoken in a tone as cold as the void: eliminate. For a moment, there was silence in the high command room where the footage played. The alien officers exchanged looks of unease and disbelief. It wasn't just the firepower. It was how the Valkyrie fought. How it seemed to exist outside the conventional doctrines of warfare. The Terrans didn't follow any known combat protocol. They didn't aim to capture, negotiate, or intimidate. They were like a predator, quick and efficient, using overwhelming force in a way no other species had ever dared. It wasn't just about strength. It was about psychological domination. The Terrans didn't fight their enemies to win. They fought to break them, to make them fear the mere mention of a Terran ship. Commander Draz, a veteran of dozens of intergalactic campaigns, couldn't shake the image of the Valkyrie, the ship that was more force than vessel. He leaned forward, tapping a few keys on the console, pulling up data from earlier engagements. Every report was the same. Terran vessels didn't hesitate. They didn't leave survivors. They destroyed everything in their path, and every enemy ship that encountered them either retreated or was obliterated. The question hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. How do you fight something that doesn't follow the rules of war? Another officer, a young Saldry strategist, spoke up, his voice trembling despite his training. What if they're not just trying to win? What if this is all a message? The room fell into an uneasy quiet. Draz's fingers hovered over the console. If the Terrans weren't fighting for victory, if they weren't seeking glory or resources, then what was their ultimate goal? And more importantly, what would happen when their methods were no longer just a fearsome reputation, but a reality that the entire galaxy had to face? The Terrans weren't just a threat. They were an unstoppable force of nature, one that had no interest in compromise, no desire for peace. They only wanted war, and to make sure no one else ever forgot it. The Council of Species convened in the Grand Chamber of the Skelfar Citadel, the seat of power for the galaxy's governing body. Representatives from dozens of star systems were present, their seats arranged in a grand semicircle, a dazzling display of alien diversity. For centuries, this council had brokered peace, regulated trade, and maintained a delicate balance among the galactic powers. But today, the chamber was thick with tension. At the center of the room stood the ambassadorial delegation from the Isheri, a species known for their diplomatic acumen. Their sleek, silver bodies shimmered under the artificial lighting, their eyes narrowed in concern. Beside them, a holographic display flickered, showing a Terran warship, massive and menacing, hovering in space. Perhaps, if we can offer them resources or a strategic alliance, the Isheri diplomat, Ambassador Mylaris, suggested with a calm but measured tone. We may still avoid conflict. We cannot risk an all-out war with the Terrans. Their ships are unlike anything we've encountered before. We must appeal to their reason. His words hung in the air, but the other delegates exchanged uneasy glances. The Xorvathi were not in the mood for diplomacy. Commander Volnkaris, the lone survivor of the ambush in the Harkon 7 system, had arrived on the heels of their disastrous defeat, his face pale, his voice still trembling from the horrors he'd witnessed. Mylaris, Karis spat, his voice hoarse with frustration. You don't understand. They don't care about resources, or alliances, or peace. They care only for fear. Fear of their power. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've felt it in my bones. You think diplomacy will stop them? I'll tell you this. If you see a Terran ship, don't speak of peace. Just leave. Run. The chamber grew heavy with silence. Karras had always been a calm, calculating officer. For him to speak this way, shaken, desperate, spoke volumes about the true threat the Terrans posed. A few voices spoke up, suggesting military preparations, but Mylaris held up a hand, silencing the room. "We cannot act in haste," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "The Council must explore all options. I have already arranged for a diplomatic envoy to meet with the Terrans. If they do not listen to reason, then we will resort to other means." Some in the room agreed, but others, notably the Saldri, were less convinced. They had lost entire fleets to a Terran dreadnought in an engagement that lasted mere minutes. A few Saldri generals exchanged glances, their faces set in grim determination. "What if reason fails?" one of them asked. Mylaris held up a hand. "It will not fail. We will extend the olive branch." The diplomatic envoy, a highly esteemed delegation of representatives from several species, left for the Terran border system. Their ship, a symbol of peace, cut through space toward a region known for its occasional Terran patrols. As they approached, the comms officer initiated the hail, their voices full of hope. "Terran vessel, this is a delegation of the Galactic Council, seeking to meet with your representatives in hopes of establishing a diplomatic understanding." The transmission crackled for a moment before a voice, calm, almost dismissive, responded. "This is the TSS Apocalypse," the voice said, chillingly neutral. "We've been expecting you." The rest of the exchange was brief, but what followed would be seared into the minds of every species who heard about it. The diplomatic ship, despite its efforts to open peaceful communication, was met with a single, blunt response. "We don't need your peace. You're either with us or in our way." And with that, the apocalypse unleashed a single devastating EMP pulse that crippled the delegation's vessel, rendering it completely inert. The envoys, stunned and unable to communicate, watched as the Terran ship turned away, leaving them adrift in the vacuum of space. The message was clear. No alliances, no peace. The galaxy would bow to the Terrans, or it would be erased. The news of the diplomatic disaster spread like wildfire through the galaxy. When the apocalypse had severed the peace talks with a single EMP pulse, it sent shockwaves through the galactic community. The delegation of ambassadors was not destroyed, but their ship was left stranded in deep space, completely powerless, with no communication possible. The silence of that message, an unequivocal rejection of diplomacy, spoke louder than any battle ever could. Across the galaxy, leaders from various star systems gathered in secret meetings, trying to determine how to respond to the Terran challenge. What did it mean to face a species that had no interest in negotiation, no desire for compromise? A species that spoke only in terms of force, of victory by sheer will. On the war-torn planet of Karras, a group of warlords, each leading fleets of hundreds of ships, held a summit. The Karrasian warlords had never backed down from a fight, their people known for their ferocity and desire for conquest. Yet now, they sat in uneasy silence, staring at the projection of the apocalypse on the conference table, its dark, imposing hull like a harbinger of doom. "This is no longer a matter of resources," General Orphic, the leader of the largest Karrasian warband, said grimly. "This is about survival. We've been on the receiving end of the Terran fury. Our ships, our best warriors, crushed in minutes. The Saldrid fleet was annihilated. The Thanner swarmed and still fell. What hope do we have? What do we do?" One of the younger warlords asked, his voice tinged with fear. Orphic stared at the image of the apocalypse before him, his face set in stone. "We fight back, or we die." But even as he spoke the words, he knew there was little hope. The Terrans weren't like any enemy they had faced before. Their tactics were brutal, efficient, and most terrifying of all, unpredictable. They had no interest in following any rules, no desire to play the game of strategy that had defined intergalactic warfare for centuries. They fought with a ruthlessness that was as alien as their warships, which were armed with technology that seemed to defy every known law of physics. Back at the Skelthor Citadel, the Council of Species was in disarray. The leaders who had once preached the value of diplomacy now found themselves grasping at any semblance of hope. A few desperate attempts were made to gather fleets, to pool resources for a retaliatory strike. But the truth was undeniable. The galaxy was afraid. And with good reason. The Valkyrie, the Apocalypse, the countless other Terran vessels that had now made their presence known, they were not just powerful ships. They were symbols of fear, and that fear was spreading. The Isheri, once the most skilled diplomats in the galaxy, began to see the writing on the wall. They had been attempting to broker peace, but now it seemed like a fool's errand. The Terrans didn't want peace. They wanted to make the galaxy tremble, and they were succeeding. Ambassador Myluris sat alone in his chamber, staring out into the expanse of stars beyond the Citadel's windows. The Terrans had made it clear they would not be swayed by diplomacy. They would not be cowed by threats. They would not be manipulated by alliances. They were the end of everything. The galaxy had no choice but to acknowledge it. For the first time in the history of the Council, a unified voice of fear echoed through the halls of power. The Terrans could not be defeated by the old methods. If they were to survive, they would need to adapt, to understand the nature of the Terran war machine, before it was too late. And as the meeting adjourned, one unspoken thought lingered in the minds of all present. Could they even adapt fast enough? The galaxy's military powers had spent weeks in frantic discussion, each day revealing more about the staggering might of the Terran fleets. There was no denying it anymore. The Terrans were not just another faction. They were a terrifying new force that had reshaped the very rules of galactic warfare. In the Xorvathi Command Center, Commander Valmkaris, the lone survivor of the Harkoon 7 debacle, now found himself sitting at the table with some of the most influential military leaders in the galaxy. His reputation as a survivor, someone who had barely escaped the might of the Terrans, had granted him an unexpected position of influence. But now, even he could feel the weight of his words as he addressed the others. We've tried to organize our fleets. We've talked about alliances, defensive lines, and counterattacks. Karis began, his voice low but filled with authority. But all of it means nothing against the Terrans. We've seen their ships. We've seen their tactics. If we continue to fight them the way we've always fought, we will be wiped out. His words hung heavily in the air, and the other commanders shifted uneasily. The Saldred general, Sarkor, leaned forward, his reptilian eyes narrowing as he spoke. Then what do you propose, Commander Karis? Do we surrender? Do we allow these Terrans to walk over us without a fight? Karis shook his head. I'm not saying we surrender. I'm saying we need to understand them, what they want, how they think. The Valkyrie didn't destroy us because it was stronger. It destroyed us because it knew exactly how to break us. He paused, looking at the faces around him. They fight without rules, without hesitation. They use fear and precision to incapacitate their enemies. We fight to win. They fight to end. There was silence as the weight of his words settled in. The galaxy had been accustomed to centuries of warfare, with structured battles, formal tactics, and calculated strategies. The Terrans, however, operated with a primal efficiency, devastating their enemies in a way that left no room for reprisal. The old methods were useless against them. A high-ranking Thanner officer, known for their tactical genius, spoke next. I studied the Terran engagements. What I've noticed is, their ships don't just fight. They adapt. We saw this in the destruction of our swarms. When our fleet overwhelmed them with numbers, they didn't panic. They split their forces, then crushed us in pieces. It was as if they knew exactly how we would fight. A voice from the back of the room, a Jayton strategist known for his brutal methods, chimed in. If they are adapting, that means they have more than just brute force at their disposal. It means they think faster than we do. Karis nodded. Exactly. That's what we need to understand. The Terrans don't just throw themselves into battle. They plan, they calculate, and they execute with terrifying speed. Their ships are an extension of that. We cannot think of them as just warships. They are weapons with minds of their own. Are we to simply let them dictate the terms of this war? Sarkor growled. Should we just bow to their strength? No, Karis said firmly. We need to find a way to turn their own methods against them. If they can adapt, then so can we. But we have to act before they can strike. If we wait for them to reach us first, we'll lose. It's time to think outside the box. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Slowly, the leaders began to understand. The Terrans didn't fight like any species they had encountered. They didn't think like the Xorvathi, the Saldri, or the Thanner. They were different. And in that difference lay both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. The key to defeating them, Karis continued, is to make them fight the way they never have before. We need to change the rules of engagement. We need to force them into a situation where their adaptive advantage becomes irrelevant. For the first time in weeks, the commanders began to discuss a plan, a new strategy that didn't rely on their old methods of warfare. If the Terrans could adapt, then so could they. The galaxy had to evolve, or it would be swallowed whole by the Terran storm. But even as they spoke of counterattacks and strategies, one question remained on all their minds. Would it be enough? The galaxy was at the precipice of something momentous. The leaders of the various star systems had come together in a rare act of unity, setting aside their differences to face the Terran threat. They had a plan, albeit an untested one. Their strategy was not born from the conventional doctrines of war, nor was it crafted to face any foe they had fought before. It was an acknowledgement that the Terrans didn't fight like any other species. They were a new breed of predator, and only by thinking as such could the galaxy hope to survive. Commander Vaughn Karis, now in command of a mixed fleet assembled from multiple star systems, stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned flagship Renegade. The vastness of space stretched before him, infinite and silent. Around him, officers from dozens of different species prepared for what would likely be the greatest military campaign the galaxy had ever seen. It was their first real chance to challenge the Terrans on equal footing, to put the theory of their new strategy into action. The plan, devised in secret over the past weeks, was deceptively simple. Rather than trying to confront the Terrans in direct combat, they would employ guerrilla tactics, using speed and unpredictability to strike at their supply lines, communications, and infrastructure. The goal was not to win a decisive battle, but to drain the Terrans' resources, to force them to spread their forces thin and eventually overwhelm them with superior numbers and coordination. It was a strategy built on disruption and attrition, not outright destruction. The fleet was small, too small to go toe-to-toe with the Terrans directly. But in its limitations lay a unique advantage, the ability to be everywhere at once. Using a combination of stealth technology and fast, maneuverable ships, the Galactic Coalition would harry the Terrans, striking where they least expected it, then vanishing into the shadows of deep space before the Valkyrie or the Apocalypse could retaliate. It was a delicate balance. Every moment counted. Every misstep would lead to disaster. The Terrans were still a mystery in many ways, and despite all their intelligence and preparation, the Coalition's leaders couldn't be sure how the Terrans would respond. "Commander Karis," came a voice from the comm station, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Quinn, an Ishari officer who had quickly become one of Karis's most trusted allies. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of nervousness. "The Apocalypse has entered the system. It's not alone. There are 2 others. We've confirmed a full Terran squadron. They've detected us." Karis straightened, his mind racing. The Terrans had found them faster than they had expected. The game was afoot. The plan was meant to disrupt their supply chain, not fight full-fledged battles. But now, they had no choice. "Prepare to engage," Karis ordered, his voice calm despite the weight of the situation. "Distribute power to the shields and weapons. We can't outrun them this time. We'll need to fight." Quen nodded. "Understood, Commander. What are your orders?" Karis's eyes narrowed as he studied the data on the holographic table in front of him. The Terran ships were formidable. He had seen what they were capable of firsthand. But this time, they had no choice but to stand and fight. "Hold position," he said. "We make our stand here. We'll give them a reason to doubt their superiority." Karis turned to the assembled officers, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew the odds were stacked against him. "We will fight like Terrans, like predators. We won't wait for them to strike first. We will make them fear us. Let them learn what it feels like to be hunted." As he gave the orders to prepare the fleet, Karis couldn't help but feel the weight of history on his shoulders. This was it. The Terrans had pushed them to the brink, but now the galaxy would push back. The first real test of their strategy had arrived. The question was no longer if they could defeat the Terrans, but how long they could survive before the galaxy itself became a battleground. The Terran fleet moved like a storm through the darkness of space, their ships formidable and relentless. The Valkyrie, the Apocalypse, and the two other dreadnoughts were the heart of their offensive, their guns bristling with power and their sensors scanning the void for any sign of weakness. They had been hunting, tracking, waiting for a moment of weakness, and now, it seemed, they had found it. But Karis's fleet wasn't going to make it easy. The galaxy's coalition had been forced into this confrontation, but there was no turning back now. The strategy had been set in motion. The coalition's ships were poised at the edge of the system, ready to spring their trap. The plan had been audacious, relying on the one thing the Terrans hadn't prepared for: unpredictability. They had always relied on their overwhelming firepower, their cold, unyielding strategy. Now, it was time for the galaxy to force them into a situation where their overwhelming might could not guarantee victory. "We're ready, Commander," Lieutenant Quen's voice crackled through the comms, breaking Karis's thoughts. Karis glanced at the view screen as the silhouettes of the Terran ships came into view, their massive forms casting shadows across the nearby planets. His heart raced. This was the moment. The first real test. The first time the galaxy would truly stand against the Terran menace, not with brute strength, but with cunning. "Initiate the disruption sequence," Karis ordered. Suddenly, all across the system, the coalition's ships moved in synchronized patterns. Their stealth systems kicked in, cloaking them in the shadow of nearby moons and asteroid fields. The Terrans had no idea where to look. Exactly as planned. The coalition had perfected their ability to vanish, using the cover of space itself to move undetected. It didn't take long for the Terrans to react. The Valkyrie unleashed a massive pulse of energy, sweeping the area for any hidden targets. It was a precise move, a countermeasure designed to flush out the enemy. Karis's heart pounded as he watched the display, but he knew that this wasn't just a game of cat and mouse. As the pulse expanded, the coalition ships darted between its waves, staying one step ahead. And then, with a single unspoken command, Karis activated the second phase of the plan. All ships, open fire. What followed was a series of rapid, chaotic strikes. Each coalition ship, hidden in the shadows, emerged at key points, targeting weak spots on the Terran ships' hulls. Their fire was precise, strategic, not enough to bring down the massive dreadnoughts, but enough to cause confusion, to disrupt their formations. Explosions rippled across the surface of the Apocalypse, small yet significant impacts that sent ripples of distortion through the Terran squadron. The Terrans retaliated quickly, their ships moving with chilling precision. But in the chaos, the coalition fleet was everywhere and nowhere, striking and retreating with brutal efficiency. The Terrans' own tactical superiority was being tested now, No longer could they rely on overwhelming power and sheer numbers. They were being forced to fight in a way that was alien to them. As the battle raged on, Karis watched the Terrans struggle to adapt. The Valkyrie fired again, its weapons seeking out coalition ships with deadly accuracy. But Karis had anticipated this. The coalition ships scattered, using the terrain of the asteroid belt to obscure their movements, making the Terrans waste precious time tracking them down. Every moment of delay, every misstep, was a victory for the galaxy's united forces. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. The Terrans, stretched thin, their coordination slipping under the pressure, made a critical mistake. The Apocalypse moved too far out of position, too close to the asteroid field. It was an opening, a small one, but just enough. Now, Karis shouted, a roar of triumph in his voice. All ships, converge on the Apocalypse. We end this now. The coalition fleet, moving with deadly precision, launched a final, coordinated assault. The Terran ship shields were strong, but they had been battered and weakened. With one final barrage, the Apocalypse's outer defenses cracked. Explosions burst across the hull, massive and violent. The Terran flagship faltered, its systems overloaded by the sudden onslaught. For the first time in weeks, Karis allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The Terrans, despite their overwhelming might, were not invincible. They could be outmaneuvered. They could be fought. As the Apocalypse drifted, damaged and burning, Karis knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy had taken its first stand against the Terran Empire, but it had shown something even more important. They weren't simply surviving the Terran war machine. They were learning to fight back. The war was far from over, but for the first time,